What if I told you there's a population in Europe whose DNA has barely changed in 5,000 years, despite invasions, empire, and war? Now here's the twist. It's not a forgotten mountain tribe or an island lost to time. It's the Dutch. Yes, the same Dutch who battled the Spanish, built a global empire, faced down Napoleon, and were torn apart in 2 world wars. Somehow, through it all, their core genetic identity remained intact. No collapse, no reset, just persistence. How? Why did ancient Germanic tribes leave a heavier genetic imprint than the mighty Roman Empire? Why do modern Dutch men still carry Y DNA markers that trace back, not to farmers or knights, but to prehistoric seafarers? And why do some regions of the Netherlands show genetic patterns that don't match anywhere else in Europe? Even more thrilling, recent discoveries suggest the Dutch weren't just passive recipients of history. They were genetic exporters, a launchpad, a nexus, possibly even the origin point for one of Europe's most dominant male lineages. And yet, the story gets even stranger, because buried deep in the DNA of modern Dutch people, especially in the north, is evidence of something far older than farming or language. A ghost signature left by Neanderthals. Not the typical 2% found in all Europeans, but a regionally unique strain, suggesting something profound, that long before the Netherlands was Dutch, it was something else entirely. In this video, we're going to peel back the soil, decode the chromosomes, and uncover a mystery that spans ice ages, forgotten empires, and prehistoric migrations. This isn't just about Dutch ancestry. It's about how DNA remembers what history forgets. So the question is, if the Netherlands changed so much on the surface, why didn't its genes follow? And what secrets are still hiding in the blood of the Dutch? Imagine dragging a fishing net across the North Sea, expecting cod, and pulling up a fragment of an ancient human skull instead. That's exactly what happened off the coast of Zealand. The bone, dark, water-worn, and ancient, would later be identified as belonging to a Neanderthal. Not just any Neanderthal, but one who walked the now submerged lands of Ice Age Netherlands over 40,000 years ago. This wasn't a fluke. Underneath the silt of rivers and beneath fields now dotted with wind turbines, Dutch soil has yielded tools, bones, and strange hybrid clues pointing to something remarkable. Neanderthals didn't just pass through the region. They lived here, seasonally, repeatedly, and they left more than footprints. Today, almost all Europeans carry about 2% Neanderthal DNA. But here's the twist. Dutch Neanderthal DNA is geographically distinct. It carries unique sequences, subtly different from those found in southern or eastern Europe. That's not random. It means that modern Dutch people aren't just inheriting Neanderthal DNA from some distant pan-European melting pot. They're inheriting it from local interbreeding events that occurred specifically in the Netherlands. In simple terms, Neanderthals and early modern humans didn't just brush past each other in this land. They got close. Families close. But why here? The answer lies in geography. During the glacial swings of the Pleistocene, the Netherlands was a corridor, sandwiched between frozen tundra to the north and temperate refuges to the south. Rivers cut through the land. Rich wetlands offered fish, birds, and mammoth trails. It was a place of movement, meeting, and seasonal return. And in that dynamic space, lineages crossed. Geneticists studying modern Dutch populations have pinpointed exact areas where Neanderthal fragments persist more strongly, especially in northern provinces and older rural zones. These remnants aren't just interesting, they're precise. Specific mutations tied to immune function, skin tone, and even cognitive traits are disproportionately preserved in Dutch samples. That means the Dutch are not only descendants of farmers and warriors, but also of one of the last Neanderthal frontiers. It's a humbling idea. That behind every surname from Rotterdam to Groningen, there might be a flicker of a Neanderthal memory, one that survived glaciers, empires, and Google Maps. But here's the mystery. If early humans and Neanderthals met here and left such a strong legacy, why did the first modern Dutch humans vanish almost entirely from the genetic record? In this video, we're going to peel back the soil, decode the chromosomes, and uncover a mystery that spans ice ages, forgotten empires, and prehistoric migrations. This isn't just about Dutch ancestry, it's about how DNA remembers what history forgets. Because if the Netherlands changed so much on the surface, why didn't its genes follow? And what secrets are still hiding in the blood of the Dutch? If you appreciate the level of detail it takes to connect ancient bone fragments to modern bloodlines, subscribe to Stone and Bone, because what we uncover here doesn't show up in school books. They came armed with blades sharper than obsidian, fire-starting kits, and a deep knowledge of rivers, fish, and forest game. These were the first modern humans to settle what we now call the Netherlands. They weren't invaders. They weren't even farmers. They were expert foragers, hunter-gatherers, who adapted to the marshes and river deltas of a changing post-glacial world. And yet today, almost none of their DNA survives in the modern Dutch population. That's not an exaggeration. Geneticists studying the ancient mitochondrial DNA of these early settlers, haplogroups like U5, U4, and I2, find that they show up today in barely detectable traces. So what happened? Where did they go? Were they wiped out by war? Disease? Starvation? Surprisingly, no. There's no mass grave, no evidence of sudden collapse. Instead, what researchers see is a slow fade out, a gradual, almost ghost-like disappearance from the genome, even though archaeological evidence shows their presence was long and widespread. And that's where the mystery deepens, because these early people weren't alone. They lived alongside the Swifterbant culture, a uniquely Dutch population that mastered wetland living. These people built settlements along river dunes, carved canoes, and maintained networks that stretched deep into Central Europe. They were, by every archaeological measure, successful, thriving even. But genetically, they began mixing and slowly vanishing. It wasn't conquest, it was assimilation. When farmers from the southeast arrived around 5300 BC, bringing with them goats, wheat, and clay pots, they didn't erase the locals. They married them, lived with them, and within just a few generations, the DNA of those original Dutch hunter-gatherers was absorbed, diluted into a new hybrid population. Not replaced, just submerged. This makes the Netherlands unique. In many parts of Europe, like Britain or Iberia, Neolithic farmers completely displaced local hunter-gatherers. But in the Dutch lowlands, something more subtle happened. The two worlds merged. And here's the twist. As farming advanced, so did selectivity. Over generations, new genes from Anatolia and the Balkans, haplogroups like G2A and N1A, began to dominate. Not because the old genes failed, but because farming gave a survival advantage. Bigger families, reliable food, more children who lived to adulthood. The result? A silent genetic revolution. The first modern Dutch people didn't die out. They were loved into extinction. But that fusion, the blend of Neolithic farming with ancient Dutch foraging, was just the beginning. Because something even more radical was on the horizon. A wave of warriors, metalworkers, horse riders, and with them came a new genetic dominator. Around 2500 BC, the peaceful rhythms of Neolithic life in the Netherlands were broken, not by war, but by a new cultural storm. They arrived carrying copper daggers, decorated drinking vessels, and horses, a symbol of status and speed. These were the Beaker people, and they didn't just bring new technology. They brought an entirely different genetic signature. For centuries, archaeologists had debated whether the Beaker phenomenon was just a shared style or a real migration. But now, genetic evidence has delivered a clear answer. It was both. Dutch graves from this period show a dramatic increase in steppe ancestry, traced back to the Yamnaya people of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These were the first real horse riders of history, migrating westward from Ukraine and southern Russia, and through their descendants, they radically rewrote the European gene pool. But here's the twist. The Netherlands wasn't just changed by the Bell Beakers. It became one of their launch pads. DNA analysis shows that British Bell Beaker individuals are more closely related to Dutch samples than to their continental counterparts. In other words, Britain's population shift didn't come from Central Europe. It came through the Netherlands. That makes the Dutch genetic brokers in one of the most important population transformations in Western European history. And the most dominant change? A Y chromosome lineage known as R1b-U106. Before the Bell Beakers, it was practically non-existent. Within a few generations, it became the dominant male lineage across most of the Netherlands, and remains so today in over 50% of Dutch men. But the invasion wasn't violent in the way we think. There are no mass burn layers, no evidence of slaughter. Instead, the genetic pattern shows male-biased integration. Steppe-descended men arriving, marrying local women, and gradually reshaping the population. It's a story of slow conquest, not by sword, but by fatherhood. And from this fusion emerged something new. A hybrid culture that would set the foundations for what we now call Germanic identity. The Bell Beaker wave didn't just change the Netherlands. It launched a transformation that would echo into the Iron Age, through the Roman frontier, and into modern surnames and family trees. But the Dutch weren't finished yet, because as bronze turned to iron and tribes became kingdoms, the land of wind and rivers evolved again, becoming a mosaic of genetic microzones, each holding tight to its tribal roots, even as empires circled overhead. By the Iron Age, the Netherlands had become a patchwork of tribes, Frisians, Batavians, Cananophates, each rooted in specific regions, dialects, and cultural codes. But beneath their differences, they shared a startling genetic continuity. Despite centuries of migration and contact, these tribes were still carrying the same Y chromosome lineages seeded by the Bell Beakers, R1b-U106 in the west and coastal zones, and I1 more common in the north and northeast. This wasn't coincidence. It was tribal geography crystallized in DNA. And the timing is remarkable, because just beyond the Rhine, a superpower was rising. Rome. When the Romans encountered the tribes of the Netherlands in the 1st century BC, they documented fierce warriors, shifting alliances, and flooded marshes that swallowed up cavalry. But what they didn't know, what we now know, is that their cultural empire would leave almost no genetic footprint. Yes, Roman rule introduced new architecture, roads, religion, and coinage. Yes, Roman legions brought soldiers from all over, Italy, North Africa, Syria. But when researchers studied ancient remains from Roman-era cemeteries in southern Netherlands, they found a surprising pattern. These southern cosmopolitan settlements showed small traces of Mediterranean DNA, but the surrounding countryside remained genetically untouched. Why? Because Roman presence was an elite imposition, not a population replacement. Cities like Nijmegen and Maastricht became cultural melting pots, while the countryside acted as a genetic firewall. And when the Roman Empire began to crumble in the 5th century, the Dutch didn't fracture. They consolidated. Enter the Franks. These weren't foreign invaders. They were genetically and culturally close cousins of the local tribes. Their arrival didn't disrupt the Dutch gene pool. It reinforced it. Recent comparisons between modern Dutch populations and ancient Frankish skeletons found in Belgium and northern France reveal something extraordinary. They're nearly identical, not because of conquest, but because of shared roots. Even as Christianity spread and kingdoms formed, the Dutch genome remained unshaken. The new rulers spoke Latin. The people learned prayers, but their chromosomes still whispered tribal names in the same dialects as before. It's one of the great paradoxes of European history, that the land most contested by empire, Romans, Franks, even Spaniards, is also one of the few where the ancient bloodlines endured. But the tests were far from over. The next threat wouldn't come from land. It would arrive from the sea, carved into the sails of longships. By the time Viking sails appeared on the horizon, most of the Netherlands was already carved into tribal identities. Christianity was spreading, trade routes were booming, and yet the coastline was vulnerable. The Frisians, Dutch coastal dwellers with deep seafaring roots, were among the first to face the Norsemen, not in epic battles, but in quiet contact. Because here's the surprise: the Vikings didn't conquer the Netherlands. They joined it. Historical records speak of raids, yes, but unlike the brutal campaigns in England or Ireland, the Viking presence in the Netherlands was subtle, scattered, and slow burning. There were no mass graves, no wholesale destruction of towns. Instead, there were marriage alliances, trade partnerships, and selective integration, especially in regions like Friesland and Groningen. So what does the DNA say? Modern mitochondrial studies, tracing maternal lineage, do show modest increases in haplogroups typical of Scandinavian populations, like H1, U5b, and V. But it's limited. Local women marrying Norse traders? Sure. But a Viking genetic takeover? Nowhere close. And on the male side? The dominant Y chromosome lineages, R1b-U106 and I1, remain unchanged, with only slight increases in haplogroup I1 in the northern provinces. It's as if the Netherlands, even when touched by Norse blood, absorbed it without being reshaped. Why? Because the Dutch were already mariners, already traders, already fierce, autonomous, and culturally cohesive. The Vikings didn't disrupt the system. They tapped into it. And that's why the Dutch experience during the Viking Age is so different from their neighbors. In England, large-scale Norse settlements left deep genetic footprints. In Ireland, entire kingdoms were Viking-founded. In Normandy, the Vikings became the nobility. But in the Netherlands, they became business partners, occasionally in-laws, rarely rulers. So when people ask, did the Vikings influence Dutch genetics? The answer is yes, but not dramatically. Instead of domination, there was diffusion. Instead of conquest, commerce. The genetic core of the Dutch held steady, just as it had through the Roman Empire and the Frankish rise. But the final test of Dutch genetic resilience would come not from pagans, but from popes, kings, and crusades. Because the next empire to claim the Netherlands didn't arrive in ships or furs. It came cloaked in gold, under the banner of Spain. At the height of its power, the Spanish Empire controlled vast territories across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Gold poured into Madrid. Armadas ruled the seas, and one of its most valuable and rebellious territories was the Netherlands. For nearly a century, Spain ruled over Dutch cities with iron and incense. They built fortresses, sent soldiers, enforced Catholic doctrine. But what they couldn't do was alter Dutch DNA. You'd expect some genetic legacy after nearly 100 years of rule. But the data tells a different story. Modern Dutch populations carry virtually no significant Spanish or Mediterranean genetic influence. Across urban Dutch centers, only 4.5% E1b1b and 6% J2 lineages, traced to North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, appear, and even those are clustered almost entirely in port cities and among elites. Rural areas, nearly untouched. Why? Because the Spanish didn't settle the Netherlands. They occupied it. Their administrators, soldiers, and clergy lived in isolated enclaves. They governed, but didn't integrate. And unlike the Vikings or Franks, the Spanish had no social or cultural overlap with the Dutch majority. In fact, the divide only deepened. The Dutch Reformation exploded in response to Spanish Catholicism. Protestant Dutch resisted not only foreign faith, but foreign blood. Marriage between Spanish officers and local Dutch women was extremely rare, socially discouraged, politically dangerous, and as tensions grew, intermarriage became treasonous. So even though Spain sent armies and gold, it left no genetic empire behind. Instead, the Spanish rule cemented the Dutch genetic firewall, creating the very divisions that would lead to the Dutch revolt and eventual independence. And this, too, tells us something powerful. You don't need to win a war to rewrite DNA. You need acceptance, intermarriage, community. The Spanish had power, but no people. They brought cathedrals, not clans. And in the end, their rule faded, leaving behind architecture, politics, and paintings, but no enduring genetic imprint. And so, after Neanderthals, farmers, warriors, and kings, through every migration, invasion, and empire, the Dutch genome held. But what does that mean for the modern Dutch person? What do their cells say now, after 5,000 years of hidden persistence? Let's look at the final genetic portrait. So, after all the migrations, invasions, empires, and revolutions, what does it mean to be genetically Dutch today? Geneticists now have the tools to answer that question down to the chromosome. The result? A population with one of the most stable genetic cores in all of Europe. Let's break it down. Y chromosome lineages, the paternal code. In modern Dutch men, about 53.5% carry the haplogroup R1b-U106, a lineage tied to the Beaker and Germanic expansion. Another 18.5% belong to I1, a branch common among Scandinavian and early Germanic populations. These two lineages have dominated since the Bronze Age. Through Romans, Franks, Vikings, and Spanish rulers, they barely budged. Mitochondrial DNA, the maternal memory. On the maternal side, the picture is equally telling. H, 45%. U, 16%. T, 14%. J, 11%. K, 10%. These lineages stretch back to early European hunter-gatherers and Neolithic farmers. Their persistence tells a story of female genetic continuity across millennia, unchanged by conquest, preserved in kitchens, cradles, and villages. And together, these two threads, paternal and maternal, reveal the ultimate secret. The Dutch aren't defined by one event. They're defined by resilience through all of them. Where other nations saw their genetics reshaped by empires, the Dutch genome absorbed, filtered, and preserved. Even the genetic contributions from Rome, Spain, and Scandinavia, though present, are small, specific, and highly localized. Urban centers show traces of global mixing, but the Dutch countryside still echoes with ancient blood. What makes this story extraordinary is not just what changed, but what didn't. In a land known for canals, trade, and adaptation, the DNA beneath it remained remarkably steady. So if you've taken a test and found Dutch ancestry in your genome, you're not just connected to a place. You're linked to a 5,000-year-old chain of survival. A line that stretches from Neanderthals in river valleys, to farmers in marshland, to traders facing Viking ships, to rebels resisting Spanish crowns, to you. This is the legacy of the Netherlands, not to conquer, not to erase, but to endure. And in a world that constantly shifts, that's a story more powerful than any empire.